who is Tom? Where'd you come from, and how did you get to the art world? And I think people have been looking at Arkive, both on your own, your guests, and ours, but a little bit of the elevator talk of like.
Sure, no problem. So I actually started in music. So degree was in audio engineering. I ran a small record label. I went to school in DC. I always liked to be behind the scenes. I was never like a multi-instrumentalist or anything like that. I liked to work the mixing board and help sort of produce more creative folks than myself. Like, how do we get the best out of that? '08 wasn't the greatest time to run an independent record label slash music studio. The whole world kind of went in smoke. I'm sure a lot of us were around during that. Released all the artists from their contract, ended up starting to do web design for the artists, like for creatives and MySpace pages. If you remember that, I had to do like custom glitter graphics, all things that turned into what became a website design business, which sort of turned into a software as a service platform for web design, for web designers. And that brought me into tech broadly. So always wanted to get back into more creative sides of things, but started there. That put me into mobile and iPhone. So I was probably right prime when that was blowing up. Launched, we had like #2 photography app in the world for a while. Sold one to a company called Tencent, which is a very large gaming and media conglomerate. And then I started a company called Omni, which did on-demand physical storage. And that kind of brought me back a little towards the art collectibles space, because we were storing people's things and we would see amazing stuff come in. The first Apple Macintosh computer, we had Rembrandt etchings. We were receiving these unbelievable items, and it made me think about just the sort of the creativity and the thought processes of just everyone. Like, if people had some free time and some thought, where did they think, where did they spend their money, energy? And that kind of, once we sold that to a company called Coinbase in 2019. And I was sitting there in the pandemic and I was thinking about all of these different things, all of this knowledge that people had of art and collectibles and different things on that nature. And could we tap that? What would it look like if they all opened up their brains and their time to start to curate their own collection? That's kind of what Arkive was born from. It was, I've always been a fan of museums. I've always been a fan of the experience of them. And that has always been kind of a few to many experience. So a few people present to many people that enter. And I was interested in what if we could do many to many. So many people come together to figure out what many people could experience.
Well, we'll come back to Arkive itself a little bit. I'm
Sure.
sort of curious, as someone who never really got hired for a job, so as an entrepreneur, and
Welcome
they
to the team.
who did music and magazines and galleries and all that. Do you feel like you're a serial entrepreneur? How do I know that 3 years from now you won't be like, oh my God, there's this new thing that's got my attention, and that you like to go in, do your thing, sell it, and go out? Or now that you're in your mid 30s, I'd say.
I'm 38. Yeah.
Okay, I always estimate 10% under. That do you see that this is where you're going to be for 10, 20, 30 years? Or
Yeah, I mean, this is a very different monster. Sounds almost like defamatory, but it is a different monster. I came at this from a different position. This isn't like I need to make a name or trying to figure out how to get my first X amount of capital or dollars. This is like impact and legacy first. I've often told people both the structure by which it's set up should over time mean I become less and less important. I think I'm less and less important almost every day, to be honest. There's like so many people joining and sort of participating and suggesting items and all these different things. So right out of the gate, it's planned for my obsolescence. That should be a goal. And hopefully in my obsolescence as a runner of it, as a
you'll be a
operator,
member.
I become a member. I hope this is a thing that when it looks, I went to church many years ago, and there used to be like pastor emeritus, like the founding pastor was still in the thing. I hope that's where I am at one point, just this guy who was there in the beginning, and that's hopefully means I get to experience all the growth. But in terms of
Let's back
participation,
it down a little bit, just for a
sure.
minute or two, to really explain what it is that Arkive is doing. I presume pretty much everybody knows what a DAO is, but we'll try to make that part brief so we can drill down a little bit further.
Totally. So the DAO of it all, I mean, you can almost think of the DAO part here, not necessarily as the full outsource of the governance, but as the outsourcing of the curatorial and acquisitions board. So you have people coming together from various different walks of life, locations, professions, bringing different skill sets and knowledge to the table to try to weaponize a pool of capital into valuable and impactful items that we can place all over the world. I think one of the core pieces that we keep coming back to is that Arkive isn't centrally located, so it's a decentralized museum. The idea isn't that the location puts context on the items, it's that the items put context in a space. And so we want to work to put those items out in the world in places that both maximize the way an individual might experience them, as well as the way that the maybe initial intent of the creator saw fit to have that presented to them. So it's a little bit double-sided there.
Well, every time I hear the word decentralized,
Sure.
I think that there's a home node
Mm-hmm.
that it's like, we're going to decentralize the internet, but it goes through Google. Or we're going to decentralize, crypto, but it goes through Coinbase. So so I'm always a little bit suspicious about people creating things that are decentralized. Isn't that sort of a stasis in some ways? I think you were saying decentralized, but the physical, an object could be that's owned, could be in Afghanistan, it could be in New York, it could be closer to where it might be used when it's physical. Sure. That sense of decentralized, but isn't it still somewhat centralized among this community? Isn't that a center?
So there's a few ways to think about that. If we wanted to use the physical items concept, we could call that more distributed than decentralized, because we're distributing the items all over the place. Okay, in terms of the voting body, since no one beyond those, there's two things at play. One, the group of individuals will organically grow and advance, so people can apply and get voted in. So it's constantly changing the makeup of the individuals who can participate, and it's always growing. So over time, the decentralization comes from the fact that there's so many individual people. So if you think of each individual person as a node, then maybe there might be some centralization around individuals that way. The only part that's really centralized is that there's things that have to be done by an off centralization body. So someone has to sign a contract, someone has to drive a truck from point A to B, from Los Angeles to Art Basel in Miami, things like that. And those things don't really need to be governed in a decentralized manner. But the core actual piece, the piece of what items do we collect, how do those come in, how is that covered, is fully decentralized. Individuals are making proposals, they're picking items, the community is then voting together as a collective.
But isn't there a team that's sort of vetting a little bit in between there?
There's two. So there is us, there is the community curatorial team, where that team is actually reaching out to individuals and then presenting. As of last week, we did our first completely decentralized round. So only the community, individuals who have been a part of it, went out to their networks, found interesting items, and they suggested them to themselves, to the community. And we actually switched to quadratic voting. So as opposed to being one-to-one, like one person, one vote, you actually have 10,000 votes that you can distribute. So even so, you can say, okay, I'd like to put 5,000 towards this, and 3,000 towards this, and 2,000 towards this, to actually try to focus on real intent and make sure that people are voting for the actual thing. So everywhere we can start to decentralize it more, we are doing that. But there is certainly a place you go, and that is Arkive. So if you're looking at it at that level, there is some centralization there as well.
And what is it that the art world should know about what you're doing that they don't, that you really saying, okay, here's what you may not understand about us?
Totally. I mean, I think there's been broad, like, art funds have been around for a while, and masterworks and things that are just sort of like, you can get experience and exposure to the art world. And I think historically, if you just looked at us on the surface without paying attention to all those things, that would be the easy write-off. That would be the bucket that you would just throw Arkive into. We've, in almost everything we've done, everyone we've worked with thus far have attempted to work directly with the artists, certainly with representational galleries, we're playing this out on a very long time horizon. This isn't, hey, let's flip this piece that we think will be worth more in 2 to 3 years. It's taking a very long view perspective. And one of the key things we're trying to do is actually increase the value and provenance and impact of the items by placing them out into public spaces. So showing them, not hiding them. If you look at, I don't, this might be risky to quote, but I'm pretty sure LACMA is below 3% of their items are actually on public display. That's a tough, that's tough when you're talking about supporting individuals and long tail items, versus our mandate is that we want to have 100% of stuff out in display. We might not be able to accumulate quite as fast as traditional institutions, but we want to make sure things are out in the spaces that people can experience them. And so I think the double on those two both aligns us quite differently than almost every historical collective of individuals buying things.
We did an interesting talk maybe 2 years ago with Adam Weinberg, the director of the Whitney. And if I remember our numbers right, and they've been about 100 years, you want to guess how many objects they have in their collection?
Sounds risky. I'm gonna lowball at 25,000.
You're really close.
Huh.
So something like that. But most people would think 1 million. You think of other prints, the design. That's not a lot. So some, the Met, I don't know, probably it's 5 million, 10 million kind of thing. So that forces the decision. I would say that having fewer things and less budget makes for better art collecting, because you got to make more careful. You have to make better decisions rather than I'll take one of these, one of those, one of those, one of these, one of these.
Sure.
Well, cost average, and maybe some of it will click. I mean, how many items do you hope to have in the next 5 years?
Next 5 years, that's tricky. I can probably get to rough math on that. This year we're about to be at our 8th acquisition, about 1 a month. We're gonna be at least 2 a month by Q1 of next year, and my guess is by Q3 we're at 3. So we're probably looking at somewhere between 30 to 40 a year. I think we're probably in the low hundreds in 5 years, maybe a little higher.
Well, let's get the money part out of the way a little bit, just to explain how that works, how, where you're getting your money from and how those Benjamins go back.
Yeah, how do the Benjamins go back? So in the current state, we raised venture capital against the overarching structure. So the core business, we raised about $10 million in March. Of that, we allocated $2 million into specifically, the conversion of dollars into antiquities and art and collectibles. That's led us to a position where we realized pretty quickly, and this is maybe the first time I've shared this. I think the original business plan was this idea that members' capital would drive itself directly into a pot, and that pot would then get converted into art and everyone would share in that spot. And where we kept running into is that money is a terrible gatekeeper for getting the right people involved. We don't necessarily just want the person who can afford a very expensive membership to suddenly have say over something. That's actually more beneficial for people who have that kind of capital. They're more interested in exposure to people who think about this nonstop, but might not actually be able to play in the space. So we've switched that and turned it on its head to actually having a traditional sort of fund structure on the background where individuals can invest their capital to have it diligenced by the DAO itself. So you're saying, hey, I could invest in art. I could put $100,000 into an art, to buy something interesting, or I could place $100,000 with Arkive, and I have hundreds of people who care about this, who think about this constantly, are now participating on behalf of my capital to try to get these items of most impact out in the world. So that edge and that uniqueness, and then the fact that you still are participating in the public display of art, kind of gets you a twofer, and that's been the massive change to the.
So it's like having 1,000 art advisors.
It's like having 1,000 art advisors,
which is like, and it's an interesting, different thing rather than having 1,000 shareholders in a work of art.
Correct.
So that's a different target. So in a sense, so are you looking to people like us for like the 1,000 art advisors who have expertise, or the 10 guys who see the dream, or both?
I think the answer is both. the capital to turn into art, I think, is almost an easier pitch, because it's almost like if you build it, they will come. That's what happens. If when I discuss this, the first thing people ask is, oh, that makes a lot of sense. I want to have exposure to alternative assets broadly. I like the idea that I'm actually supporting the arts this time, as opposed to necessarily being predatorily against the system or functioning over the system. But who are those people? Where are they? How many do you have now? What are their names? And so I think one of the best things that could happen here is both of those happening at the same time.
It's kind of like joining a museum board, and you have access to the curators, and the acquisition meetings, and the travel and the thoughts. I mean, I tell my clients that that's the best thing they can do is to join a major board, just for the interaction of that community, which is, I guess, what we come back to for what you're about, that's different than other things that are more asset allocation, is about community. Do you see any peer in that sort of way in the arts industry? Is there any place else that has community, or do we all have a community? The Baer Faxt has a community, MoMA has a community, Astworks has a community, whatever.
I think there's a lot of clusters of community that I've seen. And I think this also spans beyond just art. I think there's lots of different segmentations of people who care about creator focused things in general. And they come together. Sometimes they come together in Reddit forums. Sometimes they come together on phone calls with Baer Faxt. Sometimes they're on, young curatorial board, up and coming pieces at, the Houston MFA or something. There's a lot of these different places. They tend to not have the massive crossover, because all of those folks and individuals could participate in Arkive, right? There's not a, you can be in here, but you can't be in here. There's only so many responsibilities. And Arkive, when you look at the way the community is structured, is largely based around making those connections. So I can, right out of the gate, we have a whole group of people who got very interested in the art of fashion. And they've actually started their own small subgroup in Arkive, where all they specifically are focusing on is thinking about works of fashion that could be raised to the same level as works of fine art. And what does that look like to start going after and thinking about those as in their own context? And it's now one of the most popular sort of subgroups in the system where they're talking about that. We had a new one start where actual people who are in the community that are also artists are themselves are starting to show off like their studio work ahead of time, previews for individuals that want to see it, talking about their process, recording videos around it. So I think you start to get this very different thing when you have this really large global non-location based community. Most of the things you participate in right now are either directly tied to your interests or your location. So it would be odd for me to be on the, I don't know, the board of the Met while I live in Los Angeles, for instance. I'm probably going to live somewhere in proximity to it, but being a part of Arkive means anywhere I am in the world, there's probably other Arkive members as well. So there's a little twofer there when you think about the way the community plays together.
And what about the sort of the physical versus the digital? Both, it's part of that is what you're just talking about physically. I'm in New York and you're in LA. But some things are physical objects, some things are digital, of how things can be shared.
Yeah, I mean, so I think this is a whole massive dream for the way we think about this all, and I'm probably gonna to lower the elevation of this conversation, but I think what we think this looks like at some scales, it starts to look almost like Pokemon Go, where you land anywhere in the world and there's pieces of significance all over. Maybe you're in Oslo, New York, Jeddah, Hong Kong, it doesn't matter. When you land and you open up the Arkive app, you'll see places of items and art in locations that are all interesting. So they're benefiting each other, they're mutually beneficial. And being an Arkive member means you certainly can see them, you can check in, you can add to your profile. If you're not, it's still just the world's best immediate tour guide. If you have no idea what you want to do, you open it up and you're like, well, I'm going to go see that piece over at XYZ location. This is a great opportunity. And what does it look like to have physical items on a grid like that curated for your behalf just by participating? So I think that's one core level, is that it meets you where you are, as opposed to you having to go to a specific place to experience Arkive.
Aren't you inherently in danger of your own success, of it getting too big or too much? If there's 50,000 people in Oslo and you get there, is different than 5 or the coolest, hippest people in Oslo telling you where to go.
Yeah, so I mean, if there's 50,000 items in Oslo, we probably have overextended our Oslo hand. I think there's enough cities, people, population, and global broad-based capitals that we can put items all over. 50,000 individuals, however, going to see distinct pieces of art should be pretty doable by almost any major
But
place.
50,000 people telling you which things to look at.
Oh, I see what you're saying. You're saying a community of 50,000 strong.
Yes, in that area, I care what, those three foodies and those six sort of cool kids who went to art school are telling me what the most interesting stuff is, because there's not that much interesting stuff.
That I totally agree with. So I don't think the way we're setting up the growth of the community lends itself to 50,000 people anytime soon. I also think that would be very hard to frankly manage a community of that size, specifically on the curatorial. So we have different ways to think about expansion of the actual individuals through application that get to participate. A lot of that is actually based off of participation consistency. So if you don't participate, you slowly trail off in that voting weight. And as you trail off, new memberships are created to bring in new, fresh individuals into that. So even if there's a large amount of people, the amount of active individuals consistently participating should consistently evolve and grow, but it shouldn't outpace the ability to maintain itself. So we've put a lot of structures into it. That's a little bit of the I should be obsolete at some part, because we think a lot of this can be managed by the community itself, self-vetting individuals to be brought in and how that expands. I do think if there are 50,000 people involved, at that point, we've probably segmented into very distinct verticals, and people are probably participating in things that they are unbelievably T-shaped in. So maybe we've expanded into things like vintage cars, as well as fashion, as well as fine art, as well as sports cards and memorabilia. And there's people that are in that, not necessarily
it's a
the whole
challenge
thing.
we face of being a very niche
Mm.
audience. It's like, do we go wider? But we really lose the core of what we're about. And it's like, but are we aging out? Is it a different audience? It's a challenge that I look at, as a boomer working with a bunch of people who are way younger. It's like how to do that. You have this added sort of complication of doing this in the, NFT winter, crypto weirdness, all that news thing. To my mind, it helps you, and I'll throw in a word for a group that I like, TR Lab, that a lot of the noise of like, here's the money is getting killed. And then like, well, who has good ideas will stand out. To my mind, what you're doing is going to stand out easier as things are harder.
I like to be somewhat of a child of history wherever possible. And I think what you see in these sort of bust cycles is a lot of the next big things actually occur after the boom cycles, right? So the last 12 years of certainly tech came post 2008, right? Your Ubers, your Airbnbs, all these things that have become household names came out of that. Ooh, it got leaner. We had to get smarter. We had to get hungrier. A lot of the things that came in the boom years didn't really have the legs and foundation to build. So I think from a timing perspective, I actually kind of like that we're in a moment where you kind of have to really prove yourself again. And it's not just free things raising down from, just falling down upon people. In terms of overarching timing, when you look at stores of value, where you look at things that matter, we're building against tried and true principles. So we're thinking about things that historically have worked in almost any market, which is, larger breadth of intelligence being put into a system. How does that allow you to accelerate the overall business? And then can you use that to build communities that care and actually grow on your behalf? So I like to think that when an archive member joins over time, they'll be bringing the next 20 archive members in, or they'll at least be bringing the next 20 pieces in that 20,000 people will experience. So we have an actual network effect there.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the pieces. Is there anything you can share about what's coming or what you would love to find? I mean, we have a network of, we're not members, but we have a network of a lot of leading collectors and artists and things like that. What are some of your dream things that you'd love to have, or you think your members would love to have, or you wish you had that other people or museums have?
It's really tough to put like a bullseye on a specific, like a bolo on an item, just because I think that's almost like I can't make that call. I actually think the community will do that. What I know that we've all not uniformly, at least we've all aligned on, is that we like things that come with stories. So one of the big things is like, can we elevate a story? Is this a story that has to be told or hasn't been told? Are there people involved? Maybe they were the artist's kin or spouse or an avid collector, and you can come on and also share with people. Your story can be captured in the acquisition of the item, and we can put that out into the world. We like to elevate the overarching piece by putting it not just in the context of how it was made, but how it's been brought to us, how it was collected. This is, you know, what I think largely museums do well, and we want to continue to like learn and mimic and grow from that. So when I think about things that
Well,
we
museums are good at like, here's a room full of masterpieces.
Sure.
That's a different thing than I think which is great, and I love masterpieces, and the public does too. But I would think you have to think it's sort of alternative route, because there's big competition for masterpieces in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at sort of ultra top of market, I don't think we're ever going to play there. You know, the Tuesday night auction or something. I don't think that's going to be our bread and butter. I think we're mostly looking at probably a little more breadth and a little more risk on, in terms of we think this is something that could be more, and we're willing to put in context why we believe that. So we're probably playing in a slightly lower overarching market to just purely the existing proven masters. That doesn't mean we're not willing to take a pretty firm stance on a belief that someone is a modern master or something will one day be recognized as such. And so that's the kind of story, I think, a narrative we're trying to pull together, is people that can put that all in context.
Well, I think some of the audience members send questions like, what would I, recommend or want or something? Think of it would be a good thing for a collection like this. And I'm thinking it's like when MoMA bought every film still of Cindy Sherman.
Yeah.
They did something that tells a story, and they were able to do it with the artists in the gallery. And while there may be Cindy Shermans around the world, that's kind of certainly a unique kind of thing. One of my clients, we bought every drive-in theater photograph that Sugimoto ever did.
Amazing.
It's kind of like, okay, that's not the most expensive thing in the world, but it was like, okay, well, there's a story within that. And I think as objects, those can be their own individual narratives that you've spoken about. And that kind of thinking, like, what does no one else have?
I also think an interesting thing that we can do is, we expand, we expand beyond just fine art, right? So we've collected items we have the patent for the very first computer, for instance. That kind of stands alone as a pretty interesting piece, tying a lot of the stuff that we've been working on together. I think when you look at the existing items, we can start to make extensions and sort of fork off of those into different places. So if that is the patent for the first computer, is there a piece of art? Is there an artist? Is there someone? Can we move into a Hockney iPad drawing and tie that to the patent for the first computer? Can we use that for cohesion?
Well, you were a music guy, right?
I'd like to think I still am somewhere.
And I was a music guy sort of as a dilettante back in the early 80s. Do you remember a guy named Bob George? He produced Laurie Anderson.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I remember Laurie Anderson.
Okay. And he was a really downtown person. And he's got this archive of music. I think their intention is to have every record ever produced. There are millions of them. And they used to be, and it's a nonprofit, ARC. They used to be on like Franklin Street. And like, what are they going to do with that? I mean, I've given them all my old records, and they're really trying to digitize, but physically have the complete works of music.
Like a seed vault, like the seed vault for vinyl.
Yeah, and they get donations from like Keith Richards and people like that, but they're also all these, like every Weird record. It's one thing to have every Prince record, but to have every record of every band that played at CBGB's, interesting thing. Would you ever like try to acquire that as a DAO to give them?
This is me saying it's hard to speak on behalf of the DAO, but I think if that pitch came in, we would seriously consider how to do that, because that sounds pretty amazing, or at least how to continue to work and contribute towards what they're doing. I think if there's a group that's doing that and they're doing it really well, I don't know if the
I
solution is
think
go
it's a
buy them out.
struggle for the physicalness and the quantity. And
Yeah.
when they have that in New York City, the cost of being in that, and they move to the country, and and then all the CDs and how things are digital. But we can go offline at some point, but it just seemed to me there's a possibility of trying to own physical things, the records, but in a
I think
way
that's
that
for
no one
sure.
else can do it.
We actually had when you actually would be in this space too. When you record someone in a studio and it was analog, many people would record at the same time. You would get these sheets and they would be the knob positions for every single thing. You'd have to record where Mariah Carey's vocals were because someone else is coming in after, but you got to reset it exactly to Mariah after. And those are usually these documents that are signed by Mariah and her producer and the set engineer and everyone. And there's hundreds of thousands of these all over the place. And we've been presented with an opportunity to start getting those, that there's a person in a very prominent studio that's been saving all of the presets, the hand-drawn presets by almost every major artist that's recorded there for the last 30 years. And it's an interesting thing that just hasn't been really on display as much. And we've been those types of items.
I think the challenge for you is to have these verticals that interact just as like amazing culture, whether it's, this or that. And then the aspect of how do you display them?
Yeah.
Isn't that that's, the NFT challenge has been really lack of how do I own it? How do I display it either personally or more importantly as a museum or institution? It's like, that's almost the first thing you have to think about, isn't it? Like, how do I physically do it?
Yeah. I mean, what's happened thus far is almost every item that's been even just sort of suggested, there's been some kind of a path, or in a lot of cases, the owner that's presenting it or the artist has an idea of where they think it would be great. And you get a lot of sway when those people make the calls as to where something could be presented. So the ENIAC patent, for example, the former owner, one of the reasons he loved it is because we're willing to work with the Computer History Museum, which he's a patron of, and he would love to see this go there for 5 to 6 years on display, and that would make him happy. So we're working with him and them to get it there, for example. That's been happening quite a bit, but I fully agree that if your mandate is to not have stuff in storage, you need to get it out and put it in places that matter as quickly as possible, and that's not 100% viable quickly for every single item. But I do think there's a place for everything.
Now, how much of this are you showing in Miami at the VIP Lounge? And what's your activation there? And is it focused just on physical fine art, or is it broader?
So at Art Basel, we're showing all the physical fine art we've acquired, as well as a few of the more memorabilia, collectible, interesting curiosity items. That will be in the VIP lounge. We've built out like a 600 square foot space. So there's a whole spot inside of that where you can go view it. It's you can walk through. There might be this opportunity to do something. This is me saying it will happen, where I think we're going to be one of the first people to ever have amplified sound allowed in the VIP for about 20 minutes, 2 times during it, where there's going to be.
I mean, there's not a lot of pompous noise there all the time.
I mean, I've heard there's some noise. In this case, it'll be actual noise, and potentially a performance art piece might occur as well out in front with some dance and some other things. So we've got some interesting stuff happening there, and that'll be all next week. And we're pretty excited. It'll be the first time also that all these things will come together in one place, and potentially the last time, because they're going to start moving out into the places they're going to be on loan to for a while. So for me, it's kind of a nice culmination of phase 1 of Archive.
Well, I think what's good is that you're still figuring out what it's going to be, and you're not too rigid in your thinking. So I think whatever you are 5 years from now, I doubt we really know.
Yeah.
And that's got to be kind of exciting.
Yeah. The journey is the joy, or the joy is the journey. I'm sure I'm paraphrasing, misquoting someone who's probably significantly more famous than I. But I do believe that. And I think this has been a process where there is somewhat of a through line, that there's some things that kind of have to occur because of what you're dealing with. Like, you have to have respect for the artists, the creators, the items, the relationships. You can't run roughshod into everyone. Like, you can't just this is going to sound weird. It's like, you can't just roll in like, oh, tech bro shows up, going to do art stuff. Like, I think that's about
in
the
Miami
worst.
of all places.
In Miami of all places, I think that's about the worst possible moniker, I could have personally, and potentially Arkive could have professionally. I think we've tried our best to be, we're not running around being like, we're disrupting this or blah, blah, blah. Like, there's all these words that have been thrown around for 10 years that I think we should be post disruption at some level. It's like,
I agree with you. It's like when all the NFT shit was going on, we're disruptive, but we can't wait to be at Christie's. It's like, well, there can't be a more traditional way of doing it. It's like, and can Gagosian show me and Pace? And it's like, that ain't disruptive, bro. That's like, now you're in my house. And, we've been at it a long time. And, we've watched people rise and fall. So,
yeah, and that's how we've taken this. And I think we found that in every industry that we touch, every time we, there are rare book collectors. There's a whole world of rare book collectors. And so when we looked at things like the ENIAC patent, that came from a very different community. When we've acquired fine art, we've worked with numerous galleries at this point. And what does that look like? They have a lot of questions as to what are your intentions with this art? What are we getting ourselves involved with? What does this look like? I try to lead, I mean, this is personally and professionally, I try to lead with like a degree of thoughtfulness. And I do think we might be expanding the opportunities. I think we might be increasing the base, but I don't think we're destabilizing it. I don't think we're here to say like, oh, well, this is the way it has to be done from now on. I think there's a lot of progress that's being made on whole around a lot of this, and hopefully we're amplifying that.
but we've shown a lot of like the do-gooding and be-gooding part. We still didn't answer how did Benjamins come back to the other people. I'd like to end on that question, just
Sure.
to tie it off so that, we're not all completely altruistic.
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple different ways. So obviously the fund side of it itself has management fees and carry. That's a pretty standard process. So the fund itself charges the individuals that are putting capital in to manage their capital into this, with some expectation that there will be appreciation in return. I think a few things play out here.
How does the return happen?
Exactly. Yeah. So I think there's a couple things that are at play. One, because it's not all art, we're diversifying into numerous different categories. Each one of those categories has slightly different social mores around what does it look like to sell or maintain or create relationships. Out of the gate, that means that we can make longer positions on things like fine art and direct primary sales with artists, where we can take a pretty long view that we aren't getting your stuff to sell your stuff quickly. I think even in the existing mandate, we're at least 5 years in before we have to make any change or sale or liquidate any capital into any capital. As we push beyond that, we'll probably end up at a steady state where we have to sell roughly 5% of the overarching collection year to year to create liquidity moments for individuals on that side. And that'll most likely be tracked to individual items themselves that are massively outpacing the rest of the fund vis-a-vis their growth. So there'd be things that are showing that they are appreciating at a pace that is larger than everything else. And so we can take a shorter view because they're going out faster, as opposed to being forced into a constant flip.
And will the community members vote that? Or
yeah,
will
so
the
idea
investors
is that community investors
or the investors and the core team is making that decision?
The assumption is that will come with a combination of third-party appraisal to sort of identify where the different items are in that outpacing or pacing of the overarching collection. And then we would be presenting some degree of them all to the community to say, hey, these are the ones that are on potential. Let's say 50% of these are the ones that we have to push out. And that's probably where it would happen at that case. And I think if we can, wherever possible, we would like to do that with respect to the initial buyer. So potentially putting a ROFR or something like that into the language.
Well, I think, I'd like to wrap it up at this point and say this, for me, it sounded much different than most of those crypto bro things. That's why it was appealing to us. And I'd like to make a date to come back a year from now before Thanksgiving and say, what the hell happened? How did it grow? What were the results? And it'd be an interesting thing. I think a year is both a long time and a short time. So let's keep our eyes on what's going on. And I think you've been very open in what you're trying to do, and we appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the time. It's been really great working with you too. This has been an enjoyable experience.
And thank you to our audience. And we have this recorded, and some of you will be hearing this through other parts of the Baer Faxt, because don't transact without the.
Baer Faxt.
Okay, good. Glad you did it. We'll leave on that. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.